Why is there no God in Buddhism? Imagine a path to enlightenment that doesn't depend on some higher power pulling the strings. A tradition where the journey to understanding rests in our own hands, where the answers are within us, not in some far-off realm. When I first stumbled upon this concept, it challenged everything I thought I knew about religion. And yet, there's something deeply appealing about the idea of empowerment, that each of us holds the key to our own spiritual freedom. Today, we're diving into the fascinating and often misunderstood question of why Buddhists don't believe in a creator God. It might sound like a big statement, right? But trust me, it's more nuanced than it appears. And before we get started, I want to be clear. This isn't about pushing any agenda or dismissing anyone's beliefs. Buddhism is rooted in the idea of questioning, even its own teachings. So whether you're religious, spiritual, skeptical, or just curious, there's space for everyone here. Let's dig into this together. So, let's kick off with what we typically mean when we talk about God, an all-knowing, all-powerful creator who governs the universe. That's the kind of God most of us picture, right? I know that's the image I grew up with. It's a being that watches over everything, that sets the rules and intervenes in the world in mysterious ways. But here's the kicker. The Buddha wasn't really concerned with that. Instead, he focused on something a bit more tangible, human suffering, and how we can overcome it right here, right now. When people asked him about the nature of the universe or the existence of a God, he often didn't respond directly, brushing it off as not really relevant to the path of enlightenment. That's already a huge departure from what we might expect. To me, this focus on practical wisdom over metaphysical speculation was eye-opening. Growing up, I had been taught that understanding the divine was essential to understanding myself. But here was a figure who, instead of telling people to ponder the mysteries of creation, urged them to look inward. It was a shift in focus, from an external search for meaning to an internal one. Fast forward through the centuries, and most Buddhist traditions took a pretty non-theistic turn. Now, that doesn't mean Buddhists are atheists in the strictest sense. Some still acknowledge various deities, but not in the way most people think of gods. These beings aren't seen as ultimate creators. They're more like symbols of enlightened qualities. The idea of a creator God doesn't really factor into the Buddhist worldview. Why? Because at its heart, Buddhism is about self-reliance, and this is where the real beauty of Buddhist thought shines through. The Buddha taught that we all have the capacity for wisdom and compassion inside us, just waiting to be tapped into. That's where liberation from suffering comes from, not from some divine intervention, but from our own efforts. It's like we're our own superheroes, capable of unlocking the strength to free ourselves. And that's a radical concept, right? It means there's no waiting for some higher power to save us. We have the tools we need to shape our own paths. The Buddha's last words were, "Be a light unto yourself," which pretty much sums it all up. It's about trusting yourself, questioning everything, and not blindly following anyone or anything. This idea really resonated with me the more I learned about it. It flipped my understanding of spiritual guidance on its head. Most religions, at least the ones I had come across, encourage a kind of dependence on a higher power, whether it's for salvation, guidance, or moral authority. But Buddhism, in its purest form, hands the reins back to the individual. It says, "You've got this. You're capable of discovering the truth yourself," and that's incredibly empowering. It's a message that doesn't just apply to spiritual practice, but to life in general. Buddhism also brings in the idea of karma and rebirth, which makes things even more interesting. Karma, simply put, is the concept that our actions, good or bad, have consequences that ripple through this life and beyond. It's not some cosmic reward or punishment system handed down by a deity. Instead, it's the natural result of the choices we make. But unlike other belief systems that place a divine judge at the center of things, in Buddhism, there's no need for that. The effects of our actions are enough to shape our future experiences. We create our own reality, no cosmic scorekeeper required. This really struck me as a significant shift in thinking. The notion that we are responsible for our own destiny and that no external force is sitting in judgment is both liberating and daunting. On one hand, it removes the fear of divine retribution and allows us to focus on living ethically for its own sake. On the other hand, it places the weight of our future squarely on our shoulders. There's no one to blame for our misfortunes but ourselves, and conversely, no one to thank for our successes. Then there's the Buddhist teaching of no self, or anatta, which is probably one of the trickiest ideas to wrap your head around. Buddhism tells us that nothing, not even our sense of self, is permanent. There's no unchanging soul or essence. Everything, including us, is constantly in flux. If that sounds like a mind-bender, you're not alone. Philosophers have been chewing on this idea for centuries. But the Buddha's point was simple. Clinging to a false sense of self only adds to our suffering. Once we let go of that attachment, we're free to experience life as it really is, always shifting, always changing, but full of potential for peace. I remember the first time I really started to understand this concept. It wasn't in some academic setting, but during a meditation retreat. As I sat there, quietly observing my thoughts and feelings, I began to notice how fleeting everything was. One minute I'd be anxious, the next peaceful. One thought would arise, and then another would take its place. There was no solid me to hold on to, just a constant stream of experiences. And while it was a bit unsettling at first, there was also something freeing about it. The idea that I didn't have to be locked into a rigid identity opened up a world of possibilities, and that's where direct experience comes in. Buddhism isn't big on taking things on faith alone. The Buddha encouraged people to test his teachings for themselves. This is why practices like meditation and mindfulness are central. By observing our minds and actions, we can strip away the layers of illusion and get a clearer picture of reality. In the end, Buddhists believe the ultimate truth can't be fully expressed in words or concepts. It has to be experienced directly. Rather than getting caught up in debates about God, Buddhism invites us to turn inward, to reflect on our own experience. It's like a personal journey, with the ultimate treasure being the discovery of our own boundless wisdom and compassion. This emphasis on personal experience over blind belief is what makes Buddhism stand out. There's a famous story about one of the Buddha's disciples, Sariputta, who was challenged by a wandering ascetic. The ascetic basically said, "Hey, you Buddhists don't believe in God, so your path is incomplete." Sariputta's response was brilliant. He said, "Even if a creator God exists, that's not why we follow the Buddha's path. We do it because we've seen for ourselves that it leads to peace and liberation, not because of some external faith." In the end, whether you agree with these ideas or not, there's something undeniably appealing about the Buddhist approach. It offers a framework for exploring life's big questions without dictating the answers. It empowers us to look within, to question deeply, and to trust our own experience. And in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, that's a message worth considering.